разрешите выразить благодарность.
This is Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was born on December 18, 1878 in Gori, Georgia, in the Russian Empire. His father worked as a shoemaker and his mother was a servant, both being from Georgian serf families. During 1883, Vissarion began to get into drunken brawls and started aggressive behavior against his wife and son. Joseph's mother was a devout Russian Orthodox Christian and wanted him to become a priest. In 1895, she sent him to study in Tiflis, the Georgian capital. However, he started reading the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin after joining a secret organization which wanted Georgian independence from Russia. In 1901, he joined the Social Democratic Labour Party and organized protests and strikes. A year later, he was arrested for coordinating a strike and sent to prison. Stalin would join the Bolshevik Party and use guerrilla warfare during the Russian Revolution of 1905. He impressed the party's leader Vladimir Lenin and his ability to organize meetings and strikes, as well as his ruthless techniques to raise money for the party by kidnapping and robbery. Around this time, he adopted the name of Stalin, which means steel in Russian or man of steel. He worked for 10 years with the clandestine political movement in the Caucasus, suffering repeated arrests and exile to Siberia between 1902 and 1917. In 1930, while in exile in Vienna, Stalin wrote Marxism and the National Question, a treatise in which he presented an orthodox Marxism position. During the Russian Revolution in 1917, Stalin ran the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda. By October, the revolution was over and the Bolsheviks were in control. A civil war then followed with a Bolshevik victory. In April 1917, Stalin was for the first time elected by the party rank and filed to the Central Committee, obtaining the third highest majority of votes at the Petrograd Conference, behind Lenin and Zinoviev. He was secondly appointed Secretary of the Politburo of the Central Committee in May 1917 and remained in this position for the rest of his life. In 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, and he manipulated his role so that he was in a powerful position. Stalin's accumulation of power took the dying Lenin by surprise, who in his last writings called for the 12th Congress of the Bolshevik Party to remove the brusque Stalin. However, these attempts did not succeed because the documents prepared by Lenin were cancelled by Stalin and his eventual allies, knowing that Lenin was at that time ill and unable to participate in the Congress. Lenin died in 1924 and it was assumed that Leon Trotsky would be the next leader, but Stalin would make sure this wouldn't happen. In the struggle for leadership, one thing was evident: whoever ended up commanding the party had to be considered very loyal to Lenin. Stalin organized his funeral amid a speech expressing an undying loyalty to Lenin, while at the same time he prevented Trotsky from attending by means of deception. Stalin also accused Trotsky of having joined the Bolsheviks just before the revolution and made public the disagreement Trotsky had with Lenin in the run-up to the revolution. Once Trotsky had been eliminated from the contest for political power, Stalin became the leader. With the Constitution of 1936, eventually Stalin was effectively dictator of the Soviet Union. Eliminates any type of opposition, control the media, provide any different idea from the official one, and establish an ideological control, deporting to Siberia 2,000 of intellectuals, artists, and scientists. In the late 1920s, Stalin would aim to turn the Soviet Union into a modernized, industrialized country, and he wanted it to done rapidly. Stalin began the collectivization and industrialization plans. He developed 3 5-year plans between 1928 and 1938. Coal, oil, steel, and electricity production massively increased, but workers who failed to achieve their ambitious targets for production were executed or sent to the gulags. He also introduced collectivization to increase food production, seizing land originally given to the peasants and reorganizing it into collective farms. Mass famine was caused as a result and millions of citizens died, but Stalin saw this as a necessary evil to achieve the ambitions of 5-year plans and transform the Soviet Union. As Stalin created a cult of personality through culture, he became more paranoid. Everyone had to praise him, and his portrait was everywhere from schools to factories. The purges began with the murder of his friend Kirov in December 1934. Historical leaders and heroes of the Bolshevik Revolution were deported or executed. 25,000 Red Army soldiers, including generals and marshals, were sent to the Gulag. 8 million people died of cold or hunger interned in these camps. August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow, later called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, whose secret additional protocol divided Eastern and Central Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence, also establishing guidelines for the partition of Poland between the two states. This protocol also gave Stalin carte blanche to intervene in Finland and the Baltic countries. After the Soviet invasion of Poland on September 17, 1939, Iosif Stalin and 5 other members of the Politburo approved the execution of Polish prisoners. 21,768 Polish citizens are estimated to have been victims of the Katyn massacre. The Soviet Union denied accusations until 1919, when the government of Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged that the NKVD was responsible for the massacre and its cover-up, and handed over a portion of the declassified documents, declaring that the Katyn massacre constitutes one of the grave crimes of Stalinism. More than a year after the outbreak of World War II, considering that the fall of the United Kingdom was imminent, Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union, making the pact a detonator. On December 18, 1940, the German command made the decision to invade the Soviet Union by the Operation Barbarossa in April 1941, although it was finally carried out on June 22 of that year, when the attack on Soviet territories began with more than 3 million German soldiers. The invasion took Stalin by complete surprise, despite the fact that he had sufficient indications provided by the spy Richard Soch that it was imminent. When the invasion occurred, Stalin locked himself in the Kunstebudacha, his official residence on the outskirts of Moscow, and without going to his job in the Moscow Kremlin, in an apparent depression and lack of leadership. He only reacted 10 days later to take back control with a firm hand. It had to be on July 3rd when Stalin was able to address the Soviet people with a statement broadcast by radio to the entire country. Desperate for the Germanic invasion, Stalin decided to suspend the austerity campaign and to allow the revival of the Russian Orthodox Church, so that the believing Soviet people would join the struggle, forgetting for a while the obligatory atheists of the CPSU, incredible and expensive for the Germans. The Russian people unite in defense of their homeland. Hitler predicted that the war with the Russian giant would last at most 6 months, and that the Russian people themselves would eliminate Stalin. Although at first Stalin was hesitant and irresolute about the sudden and forceful attack by the Germans, he soon began to take control of the situation and appointed himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Red Army. He remained in Moscow in the winter of 1941, when the Germans threatened the city and organized a Soviet counterattack there. The following year, 1942, he succeeded in holding the strategic city of Stalingrad, the last defense of the capital. Despite the enormous number of casualties among his men, and later, 1943, he also defeated the German army in the Battle of Kraks, so that the whole course of the military action was changed, with the Soviets now forcing the Germans to retreat. As head of state, Stalin participated in several meetings with Allied leaders such as the so-called Big Three, with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt in Yalta and Potsdam, both in 1945. In which he achieved international recognition of a Soviet spheres of influence in Eastern Europe and showed himself to be a formidable negotiator according to the British Foreign Secretary Sir Anthony Eden. At the end of World War II, Stalin was seen as the great leader who had led the Soviet people to victory in their struggle against Nazi Germany. The Yalta and Potsdam Conference in 1945 between the Soviet Union, USA, and Britain was tense with the use of the atom bomb. The Allies did not need the help of the Soviet Union in defeating Japan, and Stalin felt betrayed, and with the rivalry between the ideologies of capitalism and communism raging it, he grew more suspicious and paranoid of the West. The Cold War had begun as he health deteriorated in the early 1950s, and after an attempted assassination, Stalin's paranoia increased even to the doctors looking after him, which he had tortured to confession of poisoning. Stalin died of a stroke on March 5, 1953. At his funeral, huge crowds gathered to pay their respect, and 500 people were crushed as a result of people surging forward. After a power struggle over who would be the next leader of the Soviet Union, from the inner circle, Nikita Khrushchev succeeded Stalin while he was a Stalinist. He would denounce the dictator and reform Stalin's policies of terror and fear during a deselestination process.
Now they announce collective leadership has been restored and wider party democracy.
The embalmed body of Joseph Stalin remained next to Lenin's in his mausoleum from his death in 1953 until October 31, 1961, when it was removed during the deselestination campaign promoted by Nikita. Buried in the outer part of necropolis of the Kremlin wall, behind the mausoleum. His grave is located between those of Suslov and Mikhail Kalinin.